All right, we'll give this a try. So I'm not going to be great probably at reading the chat box, so feel free, somebody, if they want to speak up if they didn't hear something I said or they wanted something repeated. A lot of what we actually touched upon is something I wanted to mention in terms of the background of anxiety and the structure of mental health services in the school. I am one of the school psychologists at Chelmsford High School. I think years ago, I would have started this talk with giving you a little bit of background information on my training and history there. I feel like tonight I should start with some personal disclosure, as you guys had mentioned already. So I'm a mom of 3. I have 2 4-year-olds, a son and a daughter, and I have a 1-year-old son. So just today, actually, so I'm homesick. It's not COVID, but I'm homesick. My kids are all sick. Everyone's operating at maybe, 30% all day long. We called up our pre-K, they're new to pre-K, and we said that they wouldn't be coming in today. They still have the cough, et cetera, and it's school picture day. So it's their first school picture day, and the school says, hey, bring them in anyway. It's gonna be outside, you don't have to worry, they won't stay for the day, but at least they'll be in a picture with their classmates. So now I have 15 minutes to transition everyone out the door. My son immediately starts asking all of these questions, a lot of them starting with the what ifs. And logically, a lot of them don't really make a lot of sense, especially when my responses to all of his what ifs don't seem to really resonate.
Mac and cheese, there's sandwiches. I'm leaving to go do this because
So
I can't.
when we're talking about
Thanks so much
anxiety,
for all your support and help.
You're welcome.
not feeling good, interrupted sleep, that's really not a good recipe for something like logic. So as his anxious brain is in this mode of gathering information and my anxious brain is in this mode of, I still have to battle my daughter to pick out her outfit and something that's relatively presentable for school pictures. We're not really in the great place of managing this anxiety. So we're going to come back to this later on in the presentation, but there's essentially 3 time points for intervention. Prepping beforehand, in the moment responses, and then debriefing, re-narrating, or sometimes even repairing afterwards. So really that past, present, and future kind of time points for intervention when we talk about dealing with anxiety and managing anxious kids. And there's actually a 4th option, the good news, as parents, which is to just kind of survive the moment. And sometimes you have to come back to one of those 3 things later on when you feel more ready. My daughter, last Christmas, I dragged the whole family to a photo shoot. I didn't do great at the prep work beforehand. I just we were probably up late the night before. We get there, she's just not having it. She's angry, she's defiant. We drove an hour. She probably didn't eat a great breakfast that morning. I survived the moment. So we end up rescheduling the photo shoot. And then later on, I have to sort of re-narrate and add some coherence to what happened during the day. And really my goal was to take away any sort of shame and embarrassment that she felt in terms of her not so great behavior during the photo shoot. But sometimes anxiety looks like that. Sometimes it looks a lot like anger and irritability. And sometimes it looks a lot like those what if questions and gathering information. It can look really different in a lot of people and in a lot of different age groups. So those are 2 very different examples of how anxiety can show up. And they're silly examples, right? They speak more to just kind of temperamental style in kids. We wouldn't pathologize anything of what I just described to you. We would say a lot of that behavior is probably developmentally appropriate. It's just our kind of body's normal response to anticipating uncertainty. So we're really going to keep that in mind when we talk about anxiety. And a lot of what we're going to also keep in mind is when does it really cross the threshold of requiring intervention? We're going to look at things like severity, effects on functioning, and developmental level. So as part of my to get to more of the background information, as part of my training in clinical psychology, I worked in community mental health with a wide range of ages and populations and presenting problems. Oh, am I muted now?
You're back.
Okay. I did a training at McCarthy Middle School running groups and doing some testing and meeting kids for individual work. I then went on to the Brown Center for Children, working with young kids around differential diagnosis for autism spectrum disorders and treating families using parent-child interaction therapy. My final training before coming back to Chelmsford was at a counseling center, running groups, doing individual work, and then working in an elementary school teaching coping strategies to the little ones. So really when I returned to Chelmsford, that was the first time that they added a psychologist. There was only one psychologist working there. They added me as the second one. And like we said before, now there's 3. And then the same thing that we talked about at the middle school in terms of the expansion there with psychologists. When I trained at McCarthy, there were only 2 psychologists for the 4 elementary schools, so they divided their time there. So that just really speaks to the increased need, and it's not unique to Chelmsford by any means. All of that was true in 2019 in terms of the increased needs. And now in 2021, I would say our kids are certainly struggling. I think they've demonstrated tremendous resiliency, and they're also struggling. I also think the resources that surround them are struggling. Right now it feels hard to be a parent because it is hard to be a parent. Some days I'm sure it feels hard to be a teacher because it is hard to be a teacher. So when kids are struggling and then their resources are struggling, I think that just speaks to the need to continue to try to fill our toolbox more and more for them. I know it's really frustrating for families when they finally get that readiness in their kid to seek maybe outside services, only to be met with just a huge wait list of individual therapy or testing. And that's really, that's really hard because we know that somebody's window for change only stays open for so long. So let's jump in and we'll try to cover as much as we can about anxiety and also what to do. So try to fill that toolbox a little bit more. When we think of anxiety, there's a fight, flight, or freeze response. It's protective, and it's a survival instinct. So that's going to be really important to think about because we can't get rid of anxiety. It's not something that we can, press down and never experience. In some situations, our anxiety is necessary. It's what we still use for survival. So when we experience something, scary or traumatic, if you think of our ancestors way back, they'd be walking in a forest, they'd hear a little bit of a rustling, and all of a sudden that amygdala in their brain, that fear center, activates. And it sends signals to the whole body. The body releases stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. The adrenaline, it makes your heart pound, the muscles fill with oxygen, the pupils dilate, airway opens up, blood goes to all the big muscles for running and jumping. All of that is great and necessary for fighting that bear that pops out of the forest when they hear that rustling sound. The amygdala then sends different signals to parts of the brain that's responsible for things like executive functioning, things like impulse control. So it really quiets that judgment center. It doesn't want you to stop and think and say to yourself, I heard rustling. I wonder what that could be. Maybe it's just a squirrel. Maybe it's not going to be a bear. All of that would would be bad for survival way back. So it quiets that judgment center, and instead it activates that stress response. The immune response, interestingly, is also activated. Just in case that bear gets its claws into you, your body brings that inflammation in order to stabilize any possible wound you might have. So you have your stress response activated and you have your immune system activated. So we're really wired to see danger. But now we're wired to see danger that isn't there. We're no longer having to fight those bears and those saber-toothed tigers. So where are they? That's going to be the important question. So a lot of times the bears nowadays are things like driving, picking up a phone to call a friend, studying for a test. All of these things can feel like the bears and the saber-toothed tigers, and they can feel really dangerous and threatening. Just as a side note, people with a history of trauma really have an overactive stress response and are constantly in that state of fight, flight, or freeze. So it really contributes to a lot of health problems, especially when you look at your immune system always being in that state of inflammation. So there's a lot of research that's going into adverse childhood experiences, trauma, abuse, and there's a whole list of them that if you experience these, they tend to be cumulative. The more you experience, the more your body is in this stress response and the more negative implications there are down the road just for overall health, heart functioning, etc. So it's really important to, later on, we're going to talk about what to do about that and how to counteract that stress response when it's no longer helpful to us. Anxiety is really on a continuum. And I believe that with a lot of things that we pathologize and we put labels on, a lot of that is on a continuum, and it's sort of humbling to start to identify different symptoms that might get a label put on a child. It's sort of humbling to identify some of that criteria and think, I might not be experiencing that in that extreme, but when does that show up in my life? So when we think about anxiety on a continuum, what we're really looking at are things like frequency, intensity, and duration, as well as the child's developmental level. In order to determine really what's normal anxiety versus, for lack of a better word, more abnormal anxiety, and what requires some more intervention. So things like separation anxiety, stranger danger, we can see how that's actually incredibly adaptive, to want to stick close with your caregiver and that person that provides you safety. But then it becomes a problem when it starts to interfere with daily functioning. So developmental level, that separation anxiety is no longer normative at, say, a high school level, for example. Something like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. I think we can all kind of relate to that experience of you're running out the house in the morning and you get in your car and you think to yourself, oh, did I shut the stove off? Did I shut my, hair straightener off? And maybe you call up somebody that's at the house and say, hey, can you just check this for me? Or maybe you turn the car off, you run inside, you check it, everything's fine, you continue on your day. Where that tends to increase in maybe frequency, intensity is, let's say you're halfway to work and you say, I know I checked, I know I ran inside, I just have to turn around and check one more time. Now all of a sudden you're late for work chronically, and it's no longer within that sort of typical range of what we would expect somebody to do if they're worrying about shutting off the stove, for example. Just a note about OCD, because I think it's something that within the realm of anxiety, I'm very passionate about. It's not something that if a student were to come to me with some severe OCD symptoms, especially in the setting of school, I would always refer that student out to an outside provider. I just think that that's an area of specialty that really needs to do that kind of diagnosis justice in working with the kid and getting a lot of people on board. But just to know about it in terms of it can look really different than the kind of stereotypical display of OCD that you might see on in the movies, for example, right? Like somebody's counting and doing something behaviorally that lets people know that they have that diagnosis, but it can actually present as much more quiet, especially in kids. So there's sometimes where if you look at OCD, the obsessions and compulsions, there's some students that might present with just the obsessions, and you might not see the compulsions, which is more of the behaviors that compensate for the obsessions. So some kids are really suffering with this in silence. And the thing that I'm really passionate about is it could present very unusually to people. There was an example, I was doing a training and there was an example of a girl that just started, screaming about, I swallowed the button on my clothes or whatever it was. And, as a parent hearing that, it's concerning. So sometimes these OCD can really show up in a way that makes you think like, is it disordered thinking or what's going on? The thing about OCD too is it's incredibly painful for these children because sometimes with the obsessions, the thing that they're telling themselves is actually the opposite of who they are as a person. So if you take somebody who's incredibly sensitive and kind and always looking out for other people and really aware of diversity and everybody's needs, they might develop this obsessive thought of I'm a racist, I discriminate against people. And that thought could not be more opposite maybe of who they are as a person. And that's what makes it painful. And that's causes them to experience the sense of shame. And they have a hard time even talking about this with outside providers who specialize in OCD. So it's just something to kind of be aware about as one rule out of something that you might not be evident to you on the surface, but something that the child is really grappling with inside. And I think it's just something that we need to continue to have more psychoeducation around. But just going back to that continuum, when we look at something like social anxiety, there might be children that are more shy and more inhibited. So that might be a risk for anxiety, but it's certainly not a disorder. So just kind of, if you think about, I'm very visual with all of this, but someone once gave me an example of the fire alarm going off. So let's say you're at home, you're cooking and the fire alarm goes off, but it's just smoke from the oven. So you just grab a towel, you wave it, all the kids are sitting around the table, they're not moving. That's because that it's a false alarm. Anxiety is the opposite of that. Anxiety sends everybody out of the house running and screaming, even though it's a false alarm. And they always act like, there's an emergency, there's a fire. And that's really anxiety, what your brain is telling you when it's dealing with anxiety. In terms of the definition of anxiety, Dr. Becky Kennedy is somebody that I follow a lot. She has a great newsletter, she has a great podcast, and she has great workshops available to parents and professionals. And she focuses on a lot of things that people deal with across development. So she describes anxiety as the equation of uncertainty plus our underestimation of our ability to cope. And anxiety it's this tense emotional state that occurs when you can't predict an outcome. You can't guarantee that an outcome that you want will happen. And so if you think about something like the pandemic, for example, then all of a sudden planning just gets shut down. The future is uncertain. That obviously would contribute to a spike in anxiety. Oftentimes what we do with this equation is we want to, like the example I gave you in the beginning with my son, We want to focus on that first part. We want to focus on the uncertainty. We go to Google, we information seek, we think the more we learn, the more we know, then the anxiety will go down. When actually, that's the essence of anxiety. It's based on uncertainty in the future, and we just can't predict the future. We can't know the future. And so the training tonight is really focusing on how to boost up that second part of the equation, that ability to cope and that self-confidence that we have, that we can cope when something comes up. And that's really what will change the equation of anxiety. So there's three ingredients when we think about anxiety. There's three ingredients that take place that will really determine kind of that level of severity and where somebody might fall on the anxiety spectrum. There's biological sensitivity, personality traits, and stress overload. And stress overload is really that when. So, you know, you could have the genetic loading to be more anxious. You can have certain personality traits, but it might take a certain event to really push you over that threshold and experience that anxiety. So when we think about stress overload, you know, one of the questions is, are we safe? And a lot of times, if you think about it, the cues in our environment might certainly tell us otherwise, that we're not safe. Things like being in a post 9/11 world, things like the media broadcasting, you know, different violent events that are happening in the world around us. I could certainly name a bunch, but I don't want to raise everyone's anxiety quite yet. So there's a lot in our world that says, you might not be all of that safe. You know, genetics explain about 30 to 40% of the transmission of anxiety, but there are anxious parents who don't have anxious kids, and there's anxious kids who don't come from anxious parents. There's also temperament. So kids are just, I mentioned having twins. Kids are definitely born with different temperamental styles, and it definitely makes us parent differently depending on that temperamental style and what they need. Some kids are certainly cautious and sensitive to change and fearful of new things. There's also what happens in the child's world around them. So are other people kind of modeling this anxious interpretation of things? Is there a tolerance for avoidance that feeds the anxiety? Have they been, you know, in an environment that's more critical or rejecting with high conflict? So all of that will go into determining what happens with that child. And then certainly if a child experiences a traumatic event, they're twice as likely to have some sort of emotional reaction to that. So depression, anxiety, things like that. Personality traits. So this, you know, they're not all bad when we think of what sort of personality traits might feed into something like anxiety. A lot of times these kids are very responsible. You know, they're thinking about everything that needs to happen. They might have a more perfectionistic style, which could be good, but to a point. They could have difficulty relaxing. They could be worriers. They like to please. They might avoid conflict. They prefer structure. They might have low assertiveness. They have active and bright minds because they're always thinking about what can go wrong, and they're very hypervigilant. But they can also be very cooperative and motivated and thoughtful and reflective. They could be high achievers, and then the question then becomes, but at what cost, if any? And they could be easily exploited by less sensitive peers. So a lot of different ups and downs there when we think of personality traits and what kind of goes into that equation. And so then we have all of the anxiety disorders, and I won't get into a lot of specifics with them, but you could start to see where that kind of continuum happens for kids. So there's the anxiety disorders of separation anxiety, selective mutism, panic disorder with agoraphobia, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, specific phobias, anxiety due to another medical condition. There's also anxiety disorders, like I mentioned, that are more obsessive compulsive disorders. OCD, body dysmorphic disorder, hoarding disorder, excoriation, trichotillomania. And then there's the trauma and stressor related disorders, things like reactive attachment disorder, disinhibited social engagement disorder, PTSD, acute stress disorder, and adjustment disorders. So when we think about development, that's one of the things we want to keep in mind. So the earliest average onset for all of these disorders is usually like when we think of separation anxiety disorder, specific phobias, sometimes that might come out around age 6 or age 7. Like I said, separation anxiety disorder or separation anxiety is very normative, but then there reaches a point where it becomes, where it impacts the child's functioning. Middle childhood is where you might see something like generalized anxiety disorder, a lot of what ifs, a lot of seeing danger in the world around them. And also that obsessive compulsive disorder could come out then. It could also come out later on in development. And then early adolescence is where we see that social phobia. And then the latest sometimes usually is that panic disorder, and that's more in the late adolescent years. Anxiety symptoms certainly tend to worsen over time, and there's implications in adulthood that can contribute to things like depression and substance use, self-medicating. The good news, though, is that anxiety is very treatable. There's a lot of evidence-based practices that can help manage and tolerate anxiety. When we think of stress and we think of what symptoms we might tend to see, there's mood like negative attitude, irritability, depression, anxiety, but there's also behaviors, things like aggression and withdrawal and avoidance. And then there's a lot of somatic symptoms that we see: sleep disturbance, restlessness, that rapid heartbeat, fatigue, low energy, muscle tension, breathing difficulties. So anxiety can show, and symptoms of stress can show up very differently, just depending. There's the verbal anxious child, children who might talk openly and at times incessantly about their fears and their worries. There's that undercover anxious child. They seem to have it all together, but inside their stomachs are churning, their minds are racing. They may seem fine in school, but then fall apart at home. There's a somaticizer. They may not be able to tell you what they're worried about, and actually may not have any actual thoughts or images in their minds, but their bodies exhibit this underlying anxiety like gastric upset, headaches, etc. There's the angry, anxious child who might seem more prickly and irritable, and these kids resent the vulnerability they feel and may fight the help you want to give. And then there's the avoider, the I'm not anxious, I just don't want to kind of child. So oftentimes when we think of that, the worry seems out of proportion to the risks or demands of the situation. The child can't be reassured with logical explanations. There's frequent physical symptoms, and adults really might need to spend extra time and effort to change plans, routines, get the child to take part in things like everyday activities. And the anxiety often leads to avoidance. It interferes with things like social, academic, and family functioning. So what can we do? The good news is that sometimes what we can do is actually very simple. Doesn't mean that it's easy to do, but it can seem very simple. And I think when we talk about kids who are struggling with anxiety, which continues to just increase in the world that we're living in right now, I think sometimes what we can do is also getting support for ourselves as parents, because it's really hard to be there and manage anxiety with a child when we're also struggling with things like stress and anxiety. So I'm going to go kind of back and forth in terms of what we can do with our kids, but also what we can do for ourselves, and then what kids can do on their own. But the most important thing is the goal is not to get rid of anxiety, but to really tolerate it and manage it. So the most natural and common coping mechanism for anxiety is avoidance. It feels really good in the short term, in the moment, to avoid what's making you anxious, but it just serves to kind of perpetuate that anxiety and worsen it in the long run. And that's something that's really hard. You know, we might see that in something like school avoidance. So something happens at school and the child starts to become really anxious and starts to kind of associate the school building with that really negative, anxious thought, and then they don't want to go. And then the more that they don't want to go, then the more anxiety builds up, and that becomes really difficult to tease out in terms of helping that child to cross that threshold back into the building. So like I said, what can you do for yourself and with your child, and what can your child do? So a lot of what I like to talk about actually maps on nicely to what we call self-care. I think self-care can be very preventative, both for our kids and for ourselves. There's a huge mind-body connection, and I draw a lot on the work of Dr. Domar. She actually has a mind-body program in Waltham, where she works with a range of clients around that kind of mind-body work. So it focuses on what we can do for our bodies, our minds, emotional expression, and then the coping skills and communication. So when we think of the body, what we're really talking about are things like nutrition and sleep hygiene, exercise, and relaxation. So relaxation are things like mindfulness, meditation, guided imagery, body scanning, progressive muscle relaxation, yoga, and deep breathing. And really what we're looking at with that, so when we think of stuff like exercise, so exercise helps to burn up all of those stress hormones. It releases endorphins, it can help stabilize mood, help the immune system that we talked about earlier. And one of the biggest impacts of the stress response is on the brain. So we want to, when we release those endorphins, it helps brain cells start to make new connections. It reduces those stress hormones, it reduces inflammation. Mindfulness meditation also reduces the stress response, things like breathing and awareness, and it stimulates that parasympathetic nervous system. So it's the opposite of that fight, flight, or freeze response. The parasympathetic nervous system is what we want to activate because that's in charge of things like resting, digesting, and that's what mindfulness actually stimulates. Sleep. So the stress response really resets, when we sleep, it resets that stress response. The immune system also recalibrates itself while it's sleeping, and so that's really the importance of sleep hygiene. Another really nice thing are, I mentioned earlier that those traumas are very cumulative and they build up and they, all of those negative impacts. On the other side of things, having a safe, stable, nurturing, buffering relationship is also cumulative, and that releases oxytocin and that counteracts that stress response that we talked about. So having somebody in your life that can be a support and mirror what you're going through and be there is very protective, and not only protective, but also makes up for some of those negative impacts that we talked about earlier. So when I mentioned all of those relaxation options, one of the really important things is that that's really going to, not all of those things are going to work for everybody all of the time, but the idea is that there's something that will work for you, for the child, at different points in time. And it really depends on things like how much structure works for you. So some of these tools are very structured and they tell you exactly what to do and how to do it. So, squeezing your squeezing your fists really tight and releasing. That's very structured, and there's not a lot of room for your mind to wander, versus something like meditation, where you might just be, or yoga, where you're kind of sitting with your thoughts. And so depending on how you're feeling, that could be a little bit more anxiety producing. And so maybe you want something that's more of the guided imagery that can tell you what to imagine and what to picture. But that's going to look very different depending on the person. And so that's one thing that I always say, is that it's really going to depend based on the personality. And yoga, you know, there's some kids that might hate yoga at first, and then the next year that's what they're gravitating towards. So just different points in times in terms of what's relevant. So the relaxation response, this is something it's interesting, because this is also very cumulative. And when we think of something like, you know, pharmaceutical companies and medication, and when kids start on things like SSRIs for their anxiety, for their depression, and we often tell them, you know, it's not going to work right away, and it has to build up in your system over the course of 2, 3, 4 weeks. The relaxation response is actually very similar to that. If it's something that the child can practice routinely at a regular time of the day, that also builds up, and that becomes incredibly protective in terms of addressing that stress response. So it's really about finding a quiet, comfortable place, choosing a regular time of the day. And this is harder, so this is going to be harder to do for the little ones, obviously. This is more for the older kids or for the adults to practice on average 15, 25 minutes per day in order to get that cumulative effect. There's also the idea of mini relaxations. It's sort of that portable stress manager. And so counting down from 10 to 0 and taking those breaths. There's different minis that you can do. And the really cool thing about this is that you can also, parents can model this for kids. So, you know, they could be in the kitchen and check their text message and say, oh, I forgot I have that really stressful thing to do at work. I just need to take a moment for myself, and I'm just gonna do a mini, and I'm gonna take a deep breath in and out. And then you're modeling those healthy coping strategies. And you know, you don't have to say to the kid, did you see what I just did there? Maybe you could try that. It's something that just by modeling and by the child observing tends to work wonders. And it's something that you can do just in anticipation of a stressful event, or just at a regular time of the day. For the little guys, you know, sometimes they call it like hot cocoa breaths, because it's like you're blowing on something hot. Or I always say to kids, pretend that you're smelling flowers and then blowing out bubbles. So you can make it really fun and playful when you talk about doing mini relaxations. There's also the idea of cognitive restructuring. So this could be a little tricky, because with anxiety, like I said, it's not logical. And a lot of times if you try to respond with logic, it's just going to kind of make the anxiety worse. So this is a little bit more having to do with, I said at the beginning, you know, parenting right now feels hard because it is hard. That's sort of an idea of cognitive restructuring. So at the end of the day, you know, just everything felt like a day that everything went wrong, and my kid was anxious, and I didn't have time to do, you know, any of these coping strategies, and I should have said this and I should have done that, and I just feel like I'm the worst parent in the world. So this is where cognitive restructuring comes in. Telling yourself, you know, is this thought contributing to my stress, that I'm the worst parent in the world? Yes, you know, that's not helpful. Where did I learn this thought? Well, you know, I see on Instagram all these kind of ideal parents, and that's not me. Is this a logical thought? Probably not, because the Instagram is not reality, right? And is this thought true? Well, if I take a step back and I think about what a terrible parent actually looks like, that's not me. Like, I was trying my best to fix dinner, and I did the best I could given the resources I had available at the time. Cognitive restructuring takes a lot longer than that, and it's incredibly hard to do on your own, but that's kind of the idea behind it. I want to read, let's see what time. So I want to read a little poem. It's by Shel Silverstein. And this will go into a little bit of the cognitive work too. So the poem is called What If? Last night, while I lay thinking here, some what ifs crawled inside my ear and pranced and partied all night long and sang their same old what if song. What if I'm dumb in school? What if they've closed the swimming pool? What if I get beat up? What if there's poison in my cup? What if I start to cry? What if I get sick and die? What if I flunk that test? What if green hair grows on my chest? What if nobody likes me? What if a bolt of lightning strikes me? What if I don't grow taller? What if my head starts getting smaller? What if the fish won't bite? What if the wind tears up my kite? What if they start a war? What if my parents get divorced? What if the bus is late? What if my teeth don't grow in straight? What if I tear my pants? What if I never learn to dance? Everything seems well, and then the nighttime what ifs strike again. So that's an example of all of those what ifs, right? What would we label that? Something like generalized anxiety disorder, a busy mind, kind of thinking of all of these catastrophizing scenarios. But when you look at that, you know, there's two kind of categories of scenarios, and some of them are a little bit benign, and some of them feel way more catastrophic. And so one of the ideas of something like cognitive restructuring or kind of doing some mind tricks is for the less severe ones is just adding a so in front of it. And you really have to be careful, right? You don't want to invalidate a kid's anxiety, but instead of what if, you add the so. And so that would look like, so what if I flunk that test? My teacher can let me retake it. Maybe I could study more. It won't be the end of the world. Or, so what if the fish won't bite? Well, that doesn't seem so bad. Or, so what if they've closed the swimming pool? Yeah, I could probably do something else that day, and it's not that big of a deal. You can't add so onto those more catastrophic things, because that's when it feels sort of invalidating. But that kind of gets you in the mindset of how to change your brain when you have these sort of catastrophic thoughts happening. There's also the idea of self-care in terms of emotional expression, like journal writing. And again, this isn't for the younger ones, but more for caregivers or the older kids. There's something very therapeutic about pen to paper kind of motion in terms of unlocking things. And then the idea of a mental health first aid kit. So I really like this for anybody. And the idea is, you know, there's first aid kits that we go to when we get a paper cut and we get the Neosporin and the Band-Aids, and we're prepared for it. Mental health first aid kits are very similar. We can anticipate that we're going to have a negative emotion, and we want to be prepared for it. So what can we load into like a shoebox or a decorative bag or something really fun that the kid can work on? And this can take as much time or as little time as is helpful, and to really go through the 5 senses of sight, touch, smell, taste, sound, all different things that you could put into that first aid kit. And again, they're not all going to work all of the time, but the idea is to do something rather than nothing, and the student can feel a little bit more prepared when they do get anxiety. And some of these things can work really well that are not as obvious to other people around them. So I go through, when I try to figure out what would be helpful to put in that first aid kit, I go through those 5 senses and I kind of brainstorm with the child in terms of what would be helpful. So I talked earlier, there's the idea of past, present, and future. And again, I'm going back to Dr. Kennedy, and she does really beautiful work around this. So in working kind of backwards, so prepping is really anticipating the future. So when something is going to happen that's going to be anxiety producing, it's really talking about it. And the idea behind it is that if you're able to name it and talk about it, then all of a sudden it becomes a little less scary for the child. And so really being present with the kid is the single best strategy when a child has anxiety, because anxiety is that state of being uncomfortable. It's the fear of a feeling. It's the desire to push away a feeling, the desire to run away, that fight or flight. It's the need to feel different, and I don't want to feel this way. So the idea is, in being present, we can't unfeel our feelings. And so what happens next after the feeling is going to be really important. And either we're sort of prepared to manage that feeling or we're not. And so the idea of prep work is, oh boy, you're gonna, it's not projecting the anxiety onto the student or the child, but it's sort of saying, you're going to be starting class tomorrow, and I can imagine that might be really tricky for you. What do you think about that, or whatever it might be? And I wonder if your teacher, I wonder if there's going to be blocks in the classroom, and just kind of playing a little bit of detective. Or if it's something a little bit more concrete, we're going to be going to the doctor's office tomorrow, and this is what's going to happen. We're going to sit down and really walking through all of those different steps along the way to help prepare your child. And the idea is that the child sees you talking about it, and all of a sudden feels like, okay, if mom is talking about it, if dad is talking about it, then it feels more manageable. And so Dr. Kennedy uses the idea of getting in the hole. So if anxiety is in the hole, what we want to do is really get in the hole with the child. A lot of times our instincts are to pull the child out of the hole. Oh, you don't have to worry about that. There's nothing to be scared of, right? That's pulling the child out of the hole. And that is coming across with the best of intentions and is such a kind thing to say in the moment, but it's also sending the message to the child that, oh wait, my body's telling me I'm anxious, my body's telling me I'm scared, but somebody is telling me that I shouldn't feel that way, or I don't feel that way, or there's no need to feel that way. And so now that child is feeling a little bit more alone in the feelings, and they're sort of wired for that fear and that self-doubt. So if you think about, an example would be, as an adult, we come home and we're like, oh, I have this presentation at work, I'm really nervous about it. And our partner says, you don't have anything to be nervous about. You've done presentations before, it's going to be fine. That really shuts down the conversation right away, and it doesn't leave a lot of room to cope with what's actually making us nervous. On the other hand, if you say, you come home and you're like, oh, I'm really nervous about this presentation, and your partner sits there and says, you know what, I'm hearing you say you're really nervous about that presentation. There's something about that presentation that is going on for you. I'm going to put down my phone. Let's talk about it. Tell me more. Now, all of a sudden, the conversation is open, and your partner's jumping in that hole with you to talk about the anxiety and what's making you nervous, instead of trying to pull you out of the anxiety. Things like deep breathing, I mentioned earlier, is something that we can model and something that we can prep beforehand. So like, oh, we're going to go to a class, and there's going to be some kids that are going to join right away, and there's going to be some kids that are going to sit back and kind of look at what's going on in the class. And I think you've usually been the kind of kid that sits back, but then you usually join later on. Does that sound right to you? And kind of play detective and say, I wonder what you could do if you start to feel nervous. I'm going to be there the whole time. I won't leave. I'm just wondering what things that we could do that you might find helpful. And you're not trying to get rid of the anxiety, but you're bringing it up at a time when the child's in a good space to kind of brainstorm. Positive self-talk is another kind of thing that we can model for ourselves. So something really simple like, I could be brave and scared at the same time. Like, kids, when I was little and I started school, I was scared. And I would tell myself I could be brave and scared at the same time. And you don't have to kind of equate that back to them. It's something that the child can just hear and see your modeling and then adapt for themselves. The idea of re-narrating a story and adding coherence, I mentioned earlier with my daughter with the photo shoot. Sometimes we don't always get it right. Sometimes, like I said, we're stressed, we're tired, we have a lot going on. So for example, actually, just when I was coming up here before, to give the presentation, my son said something to me, like he was talking to me and I was very distracted about, you know, getting all my stuff together. And he said something like, Mama, when we get older, will we be old? It was something really funny like that, like just the way he phrased it. And I was like, what? And I knew that there was some anxiety behind it, because it just sounded like it was some anxious thoughts going on in his mind. And so an idea is adding coherence, or kind of repairing that, could be me going back and say, hey, remember when you came up to me earlier and I was really distracted and I was probably stressed and I probably should have done some deep breathing, and you asked me that great question that was so important to you. You said something about getting older, and I'm so glad you brought that up to me. All of a sudden, that's some repair work. And you're showing that you're comfortable in addressing that anxiety and going back to it. You know, re-narrating and adding coherence could be, hey, we had a really tricky day today. We went to that photo shoot and we were running late and I was rushing and I didn't do a good job telling you what to expect. And then you were really tired and we should have made sure to have a good breakfast and get a good night's sleep. And then we got there and you didn't want to do the photo shoot. And that was so hard because everyone was telling you to smile and that was probably just so annoying. And then you're in a dress and the dress is probably really uncomfortable because you've never worn it before. And then we had to leave, and then she's talking about rescheduling and we drove all that way, and oh my God, what a day. All you're doing is really re-narrating what happened for the child, in a way that feels safe and manageable without any shame or judgment. And now that opens the door to things like problem solving and tolerating that anxiety. Hey, you know what? We said we would reschedule. I'm going to do a much better job next time preparing us in advance. And we can kind of practice and role play and do things like that. So that's just an idea of how to add coherence, because for the child, if they're in a heightened state of anxiety in that moment, there's really no coherence to their story and their experience of what happened. All they know is they felt angry and they probably were not in a good place, and maybe they said some rude things, and maybe they felt like all of a sudden they were in trouble because the photo shoot ended and they had to go home. And so there's a lot of confusing things that are taking place if you're in a heightened state of anxiety, as opposed to being able to go back later on and sort of add some coherence and safety back into that experience. So I think, you know, in terms of helping to manage anxiety, the content is always going to change. You know, it could be being afraid to go to school, and it could be being afraid to join a group of kids or go on a play date or a sleepover or speaking in front of the class. The content is always going to change, particularly with development, but it's that feeling that doesn't change. And so the idea is, if we can start to kind of help our kids tolerate that feeling, show that we're jumping in the hole with them, we're mirroring what they're experiencing, we don't have all the answers, and that's actually not a bad thing, because it could be really validating to not have the answers and say, oh, there's something about starting school that feels really tricky. Tell me more about that. That kind of thing. You're not trying to necessarily solve the content, but you're trying to sit with the feeling and come up with some strategies. So play is really great for that, because our defenses are just down in play and there's some distance. So things like dinosaurs, you know, having anxiety, but the mama dinosaur is right there with them and not leaving them. And what are some things that this baby dinosaur can do? That's an idea of play. It's an idea of something that's happening not in the moment when our defenses are down and we're more accepting of learning strategies. In older kids, it might not be that, but it could be something like role play. And you can really be silly about it sometimes, and you can kind of say like, oh, I know that you sometimes get so angry with your math work and you just want to rip up that paper when you get mad, and let's practice. So, okay, let's do a hard problem. 2 + 2 = 4. And all of a sudden that's silly and there's play, and they're like, that's not a hard math problem. And you're like, I know, just pretend. And you're showing that it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be anxious. These are okay things, but we're going to practice and we're going to kind of anticipate these responses that might come up so that in the future, when they do come up, that child feels a little bit more prepared in terms of how to respond. And a lot less alone, because you're kind of jumping, again, you're jumping in that hole with them, as opposed to saying, don't get angry, there's nothing to get angry about, you've done fine on that test before. That just feels kind of, it makes the child feel alone. But the good news, again, which I always go back to, because we don't get things right, and sometimes we could feel like, oh my God, all of these times I told my kid there's nothing to be afraid of. That's all okay, and sometimes that's really important to say, but it's just the idea of adding in those coping skills when you can, when you see the opportunity, and when you see those windows. And so that repair work, like, remember you came to me yesterday and you said how afraid you were to present, and I was like, oh, don't worry about that. I was really busy. I should have given you all of my attention because that was so important to you. And instead, I was just like, oh, you'll be fine. I'm sure that wasn't too helpful. That's an idea of a repair. And so we're never going to get things perfectly, especially when we have our own stuff going on. But it's that repair work, and it's that kind of going back and bringing up something that might have caused anxiety that I think could be sometimes even more powerful than if we were spot on that first time around. So like I said too, about the content of anxiety changing across development, one of the things that I just want to mention, and I know we're getting close to 8 o'clock, I think sometimes what happens too is that we sort of, we go to school with our kid and they're clinging to us, 7 years old, they're clinging to us, they're not joining the group. And we're like projecting, right? Then all of a sudden our anxiety starts to raise. Oh my God, my kid is the only one not joining his friends. And you kind of like naturally, like you project and you think, oh my God, he's going to be, 22 years old, not socializing with his coworkers. And like all of a sudden the anxiety is going. So I think that's a very natural thing to do, but it's also important to not sort of take what's happening in the moment and project it at a time much later on, because the truth is that those kinds of things will probably be fine, but what might be coming up for that person is, a job interview and managing anxiety for a job interview. It's not going to be, I'm afraid to go up the slide when I'm 20, but it's going to be, I'm afraid to speak on the phone with this boss who's going to be interviewing me. So the content will always change, which is why it's important to kind of front load these coping strategies now, and not try to get rid of the anxiety, but instead try to manage it. And then one last thing that I just want to kind of reframe in speaking about, like, that 7-year-old, for example, who is the only one at the party not joining his friends. That kind of thing is okay too. Like, how great is it when, we have a teenager who is not going along with her peers and doing what everyone else does just because everyone else is doing it. That's essentially what that 7-year-old is doing. They're saying, you know what, I see everybody together, everybody is joining, and I'm choosing to do something different. And how great is that, to sort of look at those characteristics of independence and listening to your body. That's one of the things that we want to keep coming back to, is that child is trusting their body and trusting their feelings, that there's something about joining that group that doesn't feel right. And I think we would honor that later on, but it's really hard to do when they're young, because again, we're like projecting what might happen down the road. But those are the things that I think are really really nice to honor for the child, of when they're listening to their body and when they know what's going on. So a lot of that, again, I took from Dr. Kennedy's work. I think she's just really good at kind of breaking all that down and also giving some concrete scripts that you can use in the moment. And just really quickly, so I had my email address up at the beginning, but there's a bunch of apps out there for kids, for parents. I'm just going through them really quickly now, but these are very like self-care apps. There's apps for anxiety, for OCD, depression, trauma. I have a huge list of them back at my office if anyone is ever interested. William James Interface is a great referral service that helps match the presenting problem, the client, with your insurance, with who's accepting insurance. It's a service for Chelmsford residents, kids that go to school in Chelmsford. It's a free, the actual referral service is free, and they'll kind of make sure that there's a match, and then they'll follow up later on to see how it went, which is sometimes kind of tricky because you know, match and relationship is everything. And sometimes it can be really hard if you're on a long wait list and then you finally see somebody and it's just not a connection. So they'll follow up with you to see how that goes. Employee programs, I always like to mention. There's something like warm lines, and this isn't for the little ones. This is more for, you know, adults and older kids. Things like warm lines for people who aren't in crisis, but who need somebody to talk to. So the opposite of hotlines. But then there's also crisis. So if there's ever any concerns around self-harm, we often use Leahy Behavioral Health that used to be located on Varnum Avenue, and now they've moved to Bridge Street. And that's just something I like to mention too in terms of crisis. But definitely feel free to reach out to my email address with any additional questions that we don't get to tonight. And let me see if I can back out of this.
Well, Vanessa's doing that. Vias put in the chat that the video of tonight's thing's going to be posted by Chelmsford TV. It's a YouTube component, so I don't know if you want to add to that. Will it be on the Facebook page, Vias, so that people can get the link?
Yes, I'll post it as soon as it's processed.
Awesome. There's a question in the chat from Emily. It says, if there's a question time, I'm wondering if she recommends kids with anxiety to try the things that make them very anxious or to let them stay back and observe.
Can everybody, do you still see my screen?
Your colored screens up there. Yeah.
Let's see. I was just trying to figure out how to stop sharing this. Let's say, nope. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so the question was about kind of doing what makes you anxious versus observing.
Yeah, she was asking, wondering if you would maybe recommend kids with anxiety try the things that make them anxious or let them stay back and observe.
I think both are important and really speak to the importance of scaffolding. So you know, maybe starting out, for example, if a child is afraid to go to a sleepover or something like that, you know, really kind of saying, geez, you know, I know you really want to go to the sleepover. I could see that you really want to go. It might be really hard for you to go. You know, I know you want to go Friday, but I think, you know, that could be really tricky for you to try. And that kind of allows for some error so that if they do try to go to the sleepover and it doesn't work out, they don't feel like a failure, but they're giving it a try. And scaffolding, I think, you know, it's doing that exposure work that it's so important with anxiety of rewiring the brain to get used to doing something that makes us anxious. And it's really the opposite of the avoidance. It's the avoidance that we want to avoid. We don't want to continue to avoid what makes us anxious, but kind of slowly exposing our body and making those kind of rewiring those different pathways so that we can practice some of these strategies in a safe way rather than just kind of throwing ourselves into the deep end. So, you know, school avoidance, for example, it could just be driving by the school. It could be driving by the school on a Sunday when no one's there. It could be driving, and then you kind of slowly increase and you drive by the school during the school day, and then you practice getting out of the car. So like really slowly kind of exposing yourself to that which is making you anxious.
Great. Someone was suggesting that to get rid of your screen, if you go down to the GoToMeeting little app, the little flowery orange circle down there, then you can go there to get out of the sharing of screen. Is any Oh, someone wanted the name of the Facebook group. Maybe Vyas, while you're there, can you just type it into the chat so people have it? The SEPAC Facebook page.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm trying to see if I missed any questions. We can, anyone else have questions? You can either put them in the chat or you can speak up or unmute yourself. And as Vanessa mentioned, like if anyone's interested in any of the specific apps, you can either email her, or if you didn't catch her email, you can email me, and we can get you in touch to kind of get you the information you might be looking at, or we, perhaps I could email back those pages of your presentation that have the apps to people who are interested.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there any other questions?
Hi, I do have a quick question. I don't think my camera's on, so sorry about that.
Okay.
So my daughter is in 7th grade. She's 12, and she's really struggling with going to school right now. So we've been trying to de-escalate that, but we're already seeing a therapist, and we've like talked to multiple people, but we're not making a lot of progress. She gets so upset before certain things, like before school and then before dance this week, that she just starts sobbing and crying, and we don't know how to break that cycle. It seems like it's the prep work that maybe we need to do, but it seems like she gets herself into this state before we can't see, and then we can't de-escalate it. Like we don't know how to de-escalate that so that we can move on and try to get her to move on to whatever comes next, getting on the bus or walking into the school building or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that, a lot of it is going to be outside of those moments around kind of finding different strategies that might help, like those relaxation strategies, those deep breathing strategies. And then also, leaving it kind of open, like, there's something about one of the lines from that workshop was, there's something about going to school that feels really tricky. And the idea of labeling it as tricky is non-pathologizing, and it's also not making any assumptions about what that feeling could be and what's going on. So, there's something about going to school that feels really tricky for you. And, seeing what happens there. You said 7th grade, so a little bit older, as opposed to more of like a play therapy where you can kind of see what comes out of that. But I think that's definitely an age where just those associations become so strong, and the child might not even know how those associations formed. Something negative happened, and it happened to happen while they were going to school or going on the bus, and all of a sudden one thing equals another. So I would definitely say kind of finding a school refusal is so it's so hard because it can, the student does get so like entrenched in that avoidance behavior. And it feels so threatening to them. So definitely somebody who can specialize in that sort of exposure work, and help them to slowly separate from the home even is a huge step, as opposed to staying at home. It gets really tricky too, because sometimes there's some secondary benefits to avoiding school that might have nothing to do with the source of anxiety and might have nothing to do with school itself. But like, when I stay home, this kind of thing happens. And so kind of figuring out, working with the child, say like, what do you think might happen if you go to school? Like what stops happening when you end up going to school or something like that? And really, I think it's hard because it feels so urgent, because it is, but at the same time, it's something that you want to give time to in order to really to work with the student, and getting everybody on board and doing that kind of exposure work, and really breaking down school into these kind of small steps and considering it a win, if they're able to drive by and, oh, you were able to, and like rating anxiety, I think is really helpful too, like, oh, we drove by the school and, where would you rate your anxiety now? That's a 2. Okay. So do you think parking the car, where is that? Is that like a 3 or is that a 4? And that kind of thing. So definitely kind of more specialized programs that work on that response, prevention, in order to help kind of develop different pathways, because right now that avoidance one is pretty strong.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? There's a question that says, around sports or extracurricular activities, if we try to give tips on how to improve and she breaks down sobbing and says she's no good, how should we help in the moment?
Yeah, I think it's so hard, right? Because we're trying to kind of model that it's okay to make mistakes and sort of, decrease that perfectionistic tendency. But with sports, it's so clear, right, that there's a right and a wrong, and there's a score at the end, and there's a winner and there's a loser, and that can be really hard. So I think, like, as much as possible, and if you had my colleague, Dr. Rosa, who's the sports guy, he'd probably have a different response right now, because I'm much more, kind of modeling with the child on how to have fun doing what they're doing and to feel good about themselves and to feel that kind of sense of mastery. I think that that's huge for self-esteem, but mastery in terms of not the score at the end of the game, but more, wow, that was really great. Your team was behind, you made that mistake, and I saw that you kept going, and that was huge. Or your team was behind and other players were giving up, but you kept playing and trying your best, and that's amazing. So really kind of focusing on what's the sort of end goal is to be resilient, to handle losses, and to push through when things feel difficult. Because right now I feel like kind of on that spectrum, on that continuum of anxiety, there's more of that sort of perfectionistic, like I'm not going to let myself make a mistake. And so depending on the age of the child too, or even older kids, you can kind of model outside of sports, model making mistakes, model, geez, I worked so hard on dinner tonight and wasn't good. That's okay. I'll follow a different recipe next time or something like that, and kind of just talking out loud about what it's like to not be perfect, but for that to be okay, I think is going to be huge. And doing it outside of sports kind of creates that distance. And then also that idea of going back and sort of adding coherence, like, you were out there and I said, you could do this better. And you know what? That was my kind of coach side talking. But you know what? You were doing the best that you could, and you're gonna let me know. You trust your body. You're gonna let me know when you want more kind of performance tips. I think something that's really powerful that I didn't mention is the idea that we have, again, very visual, like, if you picture inside of our brains, there's like a boardroom, and there's a CEO and there's all these different people sitting around the table. Anxiety is one of the members, but it's not the only member. The problem becomes when that anxiety member runs the boardroom and runs the show and is talking too much and taking and just taking over. So kind of like, talking about ourselves in parts can be really helpful. Oh, there's my anxious part showing up to the boardroom again. You know what? I'm going to allow anxious part 2 minutes, and then I'm going to say, that's enough from you. I'm going to let, I'm doing the best I can, have a turn, because they tend to be most helpful and that kind of thing. And so when we talk about ourselves in parts, all of a sudden, we're not perfectionistic, we're not anxious, that's just a part of us. And it kind of teaches the kid, the child too, they're joining themselves in the anxiety. So just like we want a caregiver or a support person to join us in anxiety to help us manage it, the ultimate goal is that they're able to join themselves in anxiety and say, oh, there's anxious part of me again. I'm going to say hi to them. I'm going to say, you know what? You're not being very helpful right now. You could stay in the room. I'm not going to kick you out of the room, but I'm going to need to hear from somebody else at the table right now. And so that's kind of a strategy that you can use across the board, depending on what it is that's causing anxiety in the child.
A follow-up to that was kind of, when do their thoughts such as like that negative self-talk, or I don't deserve that, or I can't do anything right, become concerning? Does that go to that frequency and duration slide that you were talking about?
Exactly, that frequency, that intensity, and where, is it impacting other areas of their life, of their functioning? Are they not doing things? There's definitely, when we talk about anxiety, there's a huge correlation. Anxiety and depression are best friends. They go hand in hand. Sometimes somebody who's chronically depressed can end up developing significant anxiety. Sometimes somebody who's chronically anxious can end up developing some significant symptoms of depression. So that's definitely something to be on the lookout for. And if you feel like, things are getting worse and they're exhibiting some concerning behaviors in terms of, not leaving their room, and then that's a time too to kind of seek additional support if what you're trying at home isn't working.
Great, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. Any final questions before we wrap up? Okay.
Amy, I just want
Well,
to share out that a couple of parents have shared some very specific obstacles that their children are facing right now. So I just want to again mention my email address as a resource so I can get you connected to the right provider in your schools, just to make sure that we have some follow-up to your specific concerns. I can put that in the chat.
that'd probably be good. In the chat would probably
Right.
make the most sense.
Perfect, and thank
And
you
again,
so much.
If someone doesn't catch it and wants it, you can always look, email me or look on our website as well. Vanessa, thank you so much. I think this was, very useful. We could probably talk about this for more hours going and add to it. But I think your presentation covered a lot of good topics, especially for what a lot of people are dealing with, whether it's something minor anxiety or more involved. And I'm sure it's been helpful. I had some parents who had to jump off earlier, just message me too and say thank you for the topic to SEPAC and, arranging this because they found it useful and helpful.
Thank you guys. I enjoyed it, and definitely feel free to reach out to me. And thank you for being so patient with my lack of technological skills.
No worries there. And go ahead, Amy.
I just wanted to add on behalf of SEPAC, myself, Kristen, and Vias, thank you so much, Dr. Leary, for coming out to do this. And I know this time of night can be tricky, especially for a mom.
So thank you. I think we've been entertaining this topic and having a parent workshop for some time, and your talk definitely exceeded our expectations. So you're a wonderful resource, and we're lucky to have you in district.
Thank you.
Right.
So I think unless there looks like there are no other questions, people are just thanking everybody, which is awesome. So I think we can, unless Kristen or Vias have anything to add, I think we can end the meeting.
We just say keep on the lookout. We'll send out information and post about the next meeting that gets scheduled for the SEPAC meeting. And we're going to be, you're probably going to be looking to schedule basic rights at some point too, that we do every year. And you know, if you want to, able to kind of join and help and support, even if it's just attending the meetings, we welcome, the more the merrier.
Mm-hmm. And we will be sending out a survey of parent kind of concerns or topics, things they might want to learn more about, or things that we as a CPAC should, or not should, but could, kind of bring to the attention of Amy or Amy. So we'll be on the lookout for that sometime in November.
Sounds great. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.